All right, picture this. You're running a successful tech startup. We'll call them Innovate Tech. And you're on the hunt for your next superstar software developer. Resumes are piling up, each one like more impressive than the last. But here's the dilemma. How do you move beyond the, perfectly crafted bullet points and actually predict who's going to knock it out of the park in this specific role
Yeah.
at your company
Right.
right now?
Right.
That's what we're diving deep into today, using data to make smarter talent decisions. We've got excerpts from a talent management textbook that really dig into the nitty-gritty of how organizations are using analytics to crack the code of, hiring, promoting, and even figuring out just how much those star performers are truly worth.
What's fascinating about this is that it's a real shift from simply measuring things accurately. We're talking about understanding the so what of those measurements, what they really tell us about an individual's potential for success.
It's like the difference between tracking how fast someone can type and actually figuring out if they can write compelling ad copy, right? One is a measurable skill. The other is all about the outcome, the creative magic that drives results.
Exactly. So let's say our fictional company, Innovate Tech, is trying to predict which software developer candidates will write the cleanest, most efficient code. For a long time, that decision might have been based on gut feelings, past experience, maybe a whiteboard coding test. But now, imagine applying a formal model that analyzes data, things like past performance reviews, code samples, even personality assessments, to predict future outcomes more effectively.
And that's where our trusty Swiss Army knife of decision-making analytics comes in, correlation and regression. I have to admit, these terms always sounded a bit intimidating to me
Yeah.
before I really understood what they were all about.
I get that. They can sound a bit like something out of a statistics textbook, but they're actually pretty intuitive once you break them down.
Okay, so break it down for us. What's the difference between these two tools, and how can they help someone like the hiring manager at Innovate Tech make smarter decisions?
At their core, both correlation and regression are about understanding relationships between variables. Correlation is like asking, how much do these two things go together? For InnoTech, that might be. How much does a candidate scoring high on a problem-solving test relate to them actually writing bug-free code once they're hired?
So if there's a strong correlation, it means those two things tend to go hand in hand.
You got it. Now, regression takes that relationship a step further and tries to make predictions. If we know how someone scored on that problem-solving test, can we predict, with some degree of accuracy, how well they'll perform on the job?
Okay, so this is where data starts to get really powerful. Instead of relying solely on a gut feeling about a candidate, you can use data to predict their future performance.
And potentially save time and costly hiring mistakes in the process. Regression analysis helps minimize the human bias that inevitably creeps into those decisions. Think about it. Even with the best intentions, our gut feelings can be swayed by things like first impressions, unconscious biases, even what someone wore to an interview.
We've all been there. That's why having data-driven insights can be so valuable.
Absolutely. With regression analysis, we're applying a formal mathematical model. It's taking what interviewers try to do intuitively, assessing someone's suitability for a role, but doing it more accurately by removing some of those subjective elements.
It's like taking the guesswork out of the equation.
Yeah.
But I also have to imagine that even with these powerful tools,
Yeah.
predictions aren't perfect, right?
You're absolutely right. That's where error variance comes into play.
Error variance. Okay, don't get too technical on us here. What does that mean in plain English?
Essentially, it means acknowledging that our predictions will always have a degree of uncertainty. No model is perfect, and there are always factors we can't predict. But here's the thing. Understanding error variance helps us quantify that uncertainty.
Okay, so instead of pretending we can predict the future perfectly, we're acknowledging that there's always a margin of error. But by understanding that margin, we can make more informed decisions.
Exactly. Think of it like a weather forecast. We don't expect them to be 100% accurate, but they still help us make decisions about what to wear or whether to bring an umbrella.
That's a great analogy. So we've talked about using data to predict future performance. But let's say Innovate Tech is looking at internal candidates for a promotion. They likely already have performance data on their current employees. So why bother predicting what they already know?
That's a great question, and it highlights a key point. The real power lies in building predictive models that can be applied to any candidate, not just those we already have data on.
So it's like using past data to create a roadmap for future talent decisions.
Right.
We can look at what's worked well in the past, what characteristics have predicted success in a particular role, and use that information to guide our decisions about new hires or promotions.
Exactly. It's all about making more informed, data-driven decisions. Now, remember our fictional company, Innovate Tech, looking for their superstar developer? Let's say beyond technical skills, there are some non-negotiables for this role. Maybe it requires exceptional communication skills because they'll be working directly with clients.
That makes sense. You can't exactly have a software developer pushing code to production without being able to explain what they did or troubleshoot any issues that might pop up. It's not just about writing code, it's about being part of a team and communicating effectively.
Exactly. And that's where another handy tool comes into play, the multiple cutoff approach. Sometimes it's not about finding someone who's good enough across the board. It's about making sure they meet those non-negotiable standards.
Okay, so how does that differ from the regression analysis we were talking about earlier? It seems like regression allows for some trade-offs. Maybe someone's technical skills are so strong they compensate for being a bit less communicative.
You're spot on. That's a key difference. Regression allows for those trade-offs. If someone scores lower on one measure but exceptionally high on another, that high score can potentially compensate. But with the multiple cutoff approach, there's no wiggle room when it comes to those non-negotiables.
So in the case of Innovate Tech,
Yeah.
even if a candidate aces the technical interview and wows everyone with their coding skills, if they fumble through the communication assessment or come across as lacking interpersonal awareness, they're out.
Exactly. It's like a recipe where certain ingredients are non-negotiable. You can't substitute sugar for salt, no matter how much you have. You need both to create a successful end product.
That's a great analogy, but it does beg the question. How do you determine those must-haves, those non-negotiables?
Yeah.
And how do you set a fair and effective cutoff score?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's where things can get a little tricky. If you set the bar too high, you risk missing out on talented individuals who might thrive with a bit of support or development. But if it's too low, you might end up with people who aren't quite a good fit.
So how do you find that balance?
There are several different approaches. One commonly used method is the Angoff method.
Okay, walk us through it. What's the Angoff method all about?
Imagine a group of experienced software developers at Innovate Tech getting together. They would evaluate each part of the communication assessment, like how well a candidate can explain a complex technical concept or handle a challenging client interaction. For each part, they'd determine the probability that a minimally competent person for that role would answer it correctly.
So it's about establishing that baseline of what minimally competent actually looks like for this specific role in this specific company at this specific time.
Precisely. And those probabilities are then used to calculate a cutoff score for the entire assessment. It takes the guesswork out of setting a subjective bar and instead relies on the collective expertise of people who understand the role inside and out.
That makes sense. But what about those other factors that aren't so easy to quantify? Things like cultural fit, work ethic, or that intangible it factor that can make someone a great addition to a team. Can those be factored into this approach as well?
You're hitting on a really important point. While these analytical tools are incredibly valuable, they're not meant to replace human judgment altogether. They're meant to augment it, to provide a more objective lens through which to view candidates and make decisions that are grounded in data, not just gut feelings.
So it's about finding that sweet spot, using data to guide our decisions, but not letting it dictate them entirely. There's still room for that human element, that intuition that helps us build truly great teams.
Absolutely. Now, let's say Innovate Tech has embraced these data-driven approaches. They're using regression analysis to predict job performance, multiple cutoff scores to ensure those non-negotiables are met, the whole 9 yards. But I'm curious, if these tools are so effective, why aren't more companies using them?
That's a great question. It seems like a no-brainer. Use data to find the best talent and drive better business outcomes. What's holding companies back? Is it a fear of the unknown?
That's definitely part of it. Change can be scary, especially when it comes to something as important as hiring decisions. But there's actually a name for this phenomenon: algorithm aversion. Even though algorithms can often outperform human judgment, there's sometimes a resistance to relying on them for important decisions.
I can see why people might be hesitant. It's like handing over the reins to a machine. You're putting your trust in an equation, a set of data points, to make decisions that have real human impact.
Exactly. And when we're talking about people's careers, their livelihoods, it's understandable that there's some trepidation. But here's the interesting thing. Studies have shown that this resistance often stems from a misunderstanding of what algorithms are and how they work.
So it's not necessarily about algorithms being bad or unreliable. It's about a lack of understanding and maybe even a bit of fear of the unknown.
Precisely. It's like anything new, there's a learning curve. But once people understand the benefits, the evidence supporting the effectiveness of these tools, and how they can actually be used to mitigate bias and promote fairness, that resistance tends to diminish.
It's like people are more comfortable with the devil they know, even if that devil is a bit biased or inconsistent, than they are with an algorithm that's been shown to be more accurate and objective.
That's a great way to put it. But here's the thing, it's not about replacing human judgment entirely. It's about finding ways to combine the strengths of both humans and algorithms.
So it's collaboration,
Yeah.
not a competition.
Exactly. Think of it like this. The algorithm can handle the initial screening of candidates, filtering through those resumes and identifying the ones that meet those non-negotiable criteria we talked about.
It's like having a super efficient assistant who can analyze massive amounts of data and flag the most promising candidates based on objective criteria.
Precisely. And then the human decision maker can step in, armed with those insights, to conduct those in-depth interviews, assess those intangible qualities, and ultimately make a decision that aligns with the company's culture and values.
It's the best of both worlds. The data-driven insights to narrow the field, and the human touch to make the final call.
Absolutely. Now, speaking of making the final call, let's talk about a concept that goes beyond simply finding the best candidate on paper, and that's utility.
Utility. I'll admit, that one sounds a bit like something out of an economics textbook. How does it apply to talent decisions?
It's all about understanding the real-world value of those decisions. It's not just about hiring the person with the highest predicted performance score. It's about hiring the person who will bring the most value to the organization, considering all the factors involved.
So it's about looking at the bigger picture, not just the individual scores on a test or in an interview.
Exactly. Utility analysis takes into account things like the selection ratio,
Yeah.
the proportion of applicants who are actually hired, and the base rate. The proportion of people in the general population who would be successful in that role if we just hired randomly.
So it's about understanding the context of those hiring decisions. If you're hiring for a highly specialized role with a limited pool of qualified candidates, the utility of finding that perfect fit is going to be much higher than if you're filling a more general role with a large pool of applicants.
Exactly. And it's not a one-time calculation either. The utility of a selection system can change over time as the organization's needs evolve. What's considered high-performing today might not be as valuable in the future if the company's priorities shift.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about staying agile and adapting your talent strategy as the business landscape changes.
Absolutely. And speaking of adapting and changing, let's talk about a group of individuals who often defy traditional hiring metrics. Star performers.
Ah, yes. Those elusive creatures. Everyone wants to find them. But they're not always easy to spot,
Mm.
especially using those traditional methods.
Exactly. Star performers are those individuals who consistently go above and beyond, who drive innovation and outperform their peers by a significant margin. But here's the thing. Traditional utility models often struggle to capture their true value.
Why is that? You'd think someone who consistently exceeds expectations would be easy to spot and quantify.
You'd think so, right? But traditional models often assume that performance is normally distributed, meaning that most people fall somewhere in the middle, with a few outliers at the high and low ends. But star performers, by definition, are those outliers. They skew the distribution.
So those traditional models might underestimate the value of a star performer because they're not factoring in that non-normal distribution.
Precisely. And that's why it's so important to use a variety of tools and approaches when making talent decisions. Don't rely solely on algorithms or gut feelings. Look at the whole picture, consider the context. And don't be afraid to embrace those individuals who defy traditional metrics but have the potential to truly transform your organization.
It's a great point to end on. It's about recognizing that talent comes in all shapes and sizes. And sometimes the best hires are the ones who challenge our assumptions and push us to think differently.
Absolutely. And as we navigate an increasingly complex and competitive business landscape, those are the individuals who will help us stay ahead of the curve.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of data-driven talent decisions, what's the key takeaway for our listeners?
I'd say it's this. Data can be an incredibly powerful tool for making smarter talent decisions, but it's not a magic bullet. Use it wisely, use it ethically, and never underestimate the value of human judgment and intuition.
It's about finding that sweet spot, that balance between data and humanity. And with that, we'll see you next time for another deep dive.